Imagine that you have the ability to travel through time, not a few centuries, not a few thousand years, but 252 million years into the past. You arrive on a planet that orbits the same sun, spins on the same axis, and occupies the same place in the universe as Earth. And yet you would not recognize absolutely anything you see. A single supercontinent occupies almost half of the northern hemisphere. There is no Atlantic Ocean. There is no Indian Ocean. There is no Arctic Ocean. The world is one, enormous, arid in its interior to extremes that no modern desert can match, washed by the only ocean that exists. Panthalassa, a mass of water covering the rest of the globe. The atmosphere contains barely 16% oxygen, 4 points less than today, and levels of carbon dioxide 4 to 8 times higher than current levels. The greenhouse effect turns the interior of the continent into a sustained hell. Average temperatures at the equator exceed 50 degrees Celsius. There are no permanent polar ice caps. There is no ice at the poles. But the most disturbing thing is not the landscape. It is the absence. There are no mammals in this world. There are no birds. There are no flowers. There are no grasses, no meadows, no deciduous forests. The plant world is dominated by tree ferns, giant horsetails, and primitive conifers whose ancestors we would recognize but whose direct descendants no longer exist. And the animal life you see has just survived the greatest extinction event in the history of the planet. The Permian-Triassic extinction, which occurred exactly 252 million years ago, eliminated approximately 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. The mechanism was a lethal convergence of factors that reinforced each other. Massive volcanic eruptions in the region we now know as Siberia released amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide that would have seemed impossible until geologists began measuring the traces they left behind. The eruptions lasted tens of thousands of years. Temperatures soared. The oceans acidified to the point that organisms with calcium carbonate shells, which was almost everything in the sea, simply could not build their structures. The water in the deep seas lost its oxygen and became a dead zone that expanded toward the coasts. Acid rain devastated continental soils, eliminating the humus layer that allowed plants to grow. Ecosystems collapsed in chains from the bottom up, from primary producers to large predators. For millions of years after this catastrophe, the Earth was almost a wasteland. The existing ecosystems were simple, low in diversity, dominated by a few opportunistic species capable of surviving in extreme conditions. But precisely that devastation created something that evolution always takes advantage of, an ecological vacuum of unprecedented proportions. Almost all the roles that animals had occupied for millions of years suddenly became vacant, and evolution, which tolerates no emptiness, began to fill them at a speed that the fossil record captures with astonishing clarity. In this devastated but opportunity-filled world, at some point between 243 and 231 million years ago, a group of reptiles appeared that did not in any way resemble conquerors of the world. They were small, they were relatively rare. They shared their ecosystems with dozens of other groups that seemed much more promising, and yet they were the dinosaurs. The marginal aspirants. The first dinosaurs were not the kings of the world. They were marginal aspirants in a world that already had its own rulers, and those rulers were by no means weak. The oldest fossil record of dinosaurs takes us to Gondwana, the southern supercontinent of Pangaea, between 231 and 243 million years ago. In what is today Argentina, in the geological formation called Ishigualasto, lived Eoraptor lunensis, an animal just 1 meter long and about 10 kilograms in weight, bipedal, omnivorous, agile, capable of running, climbing, hunting insects and small lizards, or eating fruits and shoots when the opportunity arose. It was not particularly imposing compared to the predators that shared its ecosystem. Ecologically, it was almost invisible. Its contemporary, Herrerasaurus, was larger, between 3 and 6 meters long, and already a considerable bipedal predator. But even he was secondary in his ecosystem. The Archosaur pseudosuchians, relatives of modern crocodiles, dominated the niches of large predators with forms such as Saurosuchus, which could reach 7 meters in length and 500 kilograms in weight, quadrupedal, powerful and lethal. Herbivorous dicynodonts the size of cows occupied the major herbivory niches. Rhynchosaurians and Etosaurus controlled the riverside habitats. dinosaurs were just one among many groups competing for the resources that the post-extinction world was beginning to offer again. What was special about these seemingly irrelevant animals that allowed them, in just 30 geological million years, to conquer absolutely every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet? The answer lies in their body, specifically in how that body related to the ground. Ancestral reptiles, including the pseudosuchians that dominated the Triassic, have a posture that biologists call sprawling or semi-erect. Their limbs extend laterally from the body, elbows and knees point sideways, and the belly may touch or almost touch the ground. This posture is efficient for short bursts of speed, but enormously costly energetically for sustained movement. Keeping the body elevated off the ground with lateral limbs requires constant muscle contraction, which consumes energy at a high rate, whether the animal is moving or simply standing still. Dinosaurs, in contrast, developed limbs positioned directly under the body, perpendicular to the ground, with elbows and knees pointing forward and backward. This erect posture has biomechanical consequences that are not immediately obvious but prove to be extraordinary. The erect posture transfers the body's weight to the bones in compression, not to muscles under constant tension. A bone in compression can withstand enormous loads with very little energy expenditure, the same reason a stone arch can stand for millennia without any external effort. A muscle under constant tension, on the other hand, consumes ATP continuously. Dinosaurs could move farther, longer, and with less energy than competitors of equivalent size. In a world where food could be scarce and territories extensive, this difference meant the survival of the fittest. But erect posture brought another benefit that was undervalued by paleontology for decades. It allowed a new way of breathing. In reptiles with sprawling posture, trunk movements during locomotion interfere with breathing. They cannot breathe efficiently while running at maximum speed, which limits their endurance. Dinosaurs, having freed the trunk from the main locomotor function, could breathe and move at the same time without limitation. And there's more. Dinosaurs, like their direct descendants, modern birds, developed a respiratory system radically different from that of any other terrestrial vertebrate. Instead of bellows-type lungs like mammals, which fill and empty with each respiratory cycle, dinosaurs had lungs with continuous flow, assisted by a series of air sacs acting as auxiliary bellows. Air flowed in a single direction through the lung, rather than entering and exiting the same way. This means that oxygen exchange occurred during both inhalation and exhalation, and the lung never contained oxygen-poor residual air, as occurs in mammals at the end of exhalation. In the low-oxygen atmosphere of the late Triassic, this respiratory efficiency was no minor advantage. It was the difference between acting or collapsing. These anatomical innovations combined to create an animal that, gram for gram of body mass, could process more energy, move more sustainably, and access resources over a greater geographic radius than any competitor of its time. Yet even with all these advantages, dinosaurs were still a secondary group in the Triassic. They were missing something more, and that something would come as so many things in the history of life in the form of catastrophe. The second gift. 201 million years ago, when Pangaea began to break apart to give rise to the modern oceans, the Earth received another blow. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction eliminated approximately 76% of existing species. For the large pseudosuchian archosaurs, it was the final blow. The vast majority of this group disappeared in a geologically brief period. The most likely cause was the massive volcanism of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest eruptions in the planet's history, which released colossal amounts of carbon dioxide in just a few thousand years. Global temperatures rose by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, the oceans acidified, vegetation transformed abruptly, food chains destabilized from the base up. For the dinosaurs, this catastrophe was the second unexpected gift of history. They had likely survived thanks to their more efficient respiratory system in carbon dioxide-rich and oxygen-poor atmospheres and their lower dependence on environmental temperature, while their main competitors perished. Crossing the threshold into the Jurassic period, 200 million years ago, the dinosaurs found themselves in a world where almost all the major continental ecological niches were empty. And this time, they would fill them. What happened next was one of the fastest and most spectacular adaptive radiations in the history of life on Earth. In the geologically brief span of 20 to 30 million years, between 200 and 170 million years ago, the dinosaurs went from being a relatively small group to absolutely dominating every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet, all continents, all climates, from the equator to the polar circles, from the coasts to the driest interior valleys. This radiation was not random. It was the direct result of anatomical advantages that the dinosaurs had accumulated during the Triassic, now free to express themselves without the competitive pressure of the large pseudosuchians. In an ecological vacuum, a small advantage becomes a huge advantage, and the dinosaurs had several. But to understand why they were able to become so large, so diverse, and so dominant, we need to talk about a fourth innovation that may be the most counterintuitive of all. Their bones were largely hollow. The giants and the secret of their size. Sauropods are the group of land animals that have ever existed and were the largest on the surface of this planet. Patagotitan majorum, discovered in Argentine Patagonia in 2014 and scientifically described in 2017, had an estimated length of 37 meters and a weight of 69 metric tons. That is the equivalent in weight of 9 adult African elephants, combined into a single animal that walked on 4 columns of bone. Argentinosaurus, known from fragments but extrapolated with statistical rigor, could have reached 80 or even 100 tons. No terrestrial mammal that has ever existed even remotely approaches these dimensions. The obvious question is how? How can a land animal reach that size? The answer involves a series of anatomical innovations that combined uniquely in sauropods, making these animals one of the most extraordinary evolutionary experiments in the history of life. The first secret is bone pneumatization. Sauropod bones were not solid masses of mineral tissue like those of an elephant or rhinoceros. They were deeply excavated by air cavities connected through canals to the air sacs of the continuous flow respiratory system. In some specimens, the solid bone tissue represents less than 10% of the total bone volume, and the remaining 90% is air. The vertebrae of an adult sauropod had an internal architecture comparable to high-tech foam structures that modern aeronautical engineers designed to maximize structural stiffness while minimizing weight. Evolution arrived at the same solution 150 million years before any human could even imagine it. The second secret is neck architecture. Sauropod necks could reach 15 meters in length in the most extreme species. Supersaurus vivus had the longest individual neck known in any animal that has ever existed. And this neck was not a solid mass of muscle and bone, but an astonishing engineering structure. Deeply pneumatized vertebrae with long processes serving as levers for the musculature, organized to maximize vertical and horizontal reach with minimal energy expenditure. A diplodocus, standing in one spot, could access vegetation over an area of several hundred square meters simply by moving its neck. In energetic terms, moving a 200-kilogram neck is incomparably cheaper than moving a 30-ton body. The third secret is the absence of chewing. Sauropods did not chew their food. Their teeth were simple peg or spoon-shaped structures designed solely to strip vegetation and swallow it directly. Mechanical processing, that is, breaking down plant cellulose, occurred in the enormous digestive tract where a combination of gastroliths, deliberately ingested stones, and fermenting bacteria did the work that teeth and rumination perform in herbivorous mammals. This allowed extraordinarily high feeding rates. No time was wasted chewing. A brachiosaurus needed to consume between 200 and 400 kilograms of vegetation per day to sustain its metabolism, and it could do so at a speed that a similarly sized herbivorous mammal could not match. The fourth secret is growth rate. Osteohistological analyses, the study of bone microstructure under a microscope, reveal that dinosaurs grew at rates more reminiscent of mammals than of modern reptiles. In sauropod bones, annual growth lines similar to tree rings are observed, and the density and type of tissue between these lines indicates rapid deposition, consistent with sustained year-round growth, not just during the favorable season. A sauropod could reach adult size in 20 to 30 years, a speed that, for animals of this size, has no parallel in any living vertebrate group. A newborn Apatosaurus weighed approximately 5 kilograms, the size of a domestic cat. In its first year of life, it could weigh over 100 kilograms. In 10 years, several tons. This explosive growth was possible because the dinosaur metabolism more active than that of modern reptiles, though perhaps not as costly as that of mammals, could direct large amounts of energy toward growth when food resources were abundant. And in the Jurassic, food resources were generally abundant. The question of dinosaur metabolism is itself one of the most fascinating debates in modern paleontology. For most of the 20th century, dinosaurs were classified as ectothermic or cold-blooded by default, simply because they were reptiles, and all modern reptiles are ectothermic. This classification began to be questioned in the 1970s, when the paleontologist Robert Bakker argued with anatomical and biogeographical evidence that dinosaurs were active endotherms, comparable physiologically to modern birds and mammals. Evidence accumulated in the following decades favored a more nuanced position. Oxygen isotope analyses in bone tissue show relatively constant and elevated body temperatures in dinosaurs, regardless of environmental temperature, which is a hallmark of endothermy. Osteohistological studies show rapidly growing fibrolamellar bone, characteristic of endotherms, not the slow-growing bone of modern variable-temperature reptiles. But calculations of the metabolic expenditure needed to sustain the size of large sauropods are difficult to reconcile with strict mammal-style endothermy, which would have required amounts of food that the Jurassic ecosystem might not have been able to provide. The solution now accepted by most specialists is mesothermy, an intermediate point where dinosaurs generated metabolic heat internally and therefore had more active metabolisms than modern reptiles, but without maintaining body temperature in the narrow and costly range of modern mammals and birds. This mesothermic position gave them the best of both worlds, the sustained activity of a warm-blooded animal without the prohibitive energy cost of strict endothermy. In the context of the Jurassic, with its warm climate and productive ecosystems, it was the perfect strategy. The feather revolution. There is a deeply ingrained perspective error in popular culture about dinosaurs. The image of animals covered in grey or brown scales, with dermal surfaces similar to those of a giant crocodile, creatures that visually belong to the world of modern reptiles. It is an image that the fossil record has systematically and definitively disproven over the last 3 decades, and that has been replaced by something far more astonishing. Dinosaurs had feathers. Not all of them, not in the same way, not with the same distribution, but direct evidence of feathers or homologous filamentous structures, dermal fibrils sharing the same basic protein, beta-keratin, and the same molecular structure as modern feathers exists in at least 29 genera of dinosaurs, and phylogenetic analyses suggest that the common ancestor of all Saurischian dinosaurs probably had some form of similar covering. Scales were the exception, not the rule, in at least half of the dinosaurian tree. The discovery that changed everything was in the Yixian Basin, in China's Liaoning province, beginning in the mid-1990s. A series of lacustrine lower Cretaceous sites began producing fossils with soft tissue preservation unparalleled in the world: feathers, skin, scales, pigments, even stomach contents, and in ovo-embryos. Sinosauropteryx prima, the first confirmed non-avian dinosaur with filamentous structures, was described in 1996. It was followed by dozens more genera: Caudipteryx, Microraptor, Anchiornis, Epidexipteryx, Euanchuavis, and many others. But the revolution was not just the realization that dinosaurs had feathers. It was the revelation of what those feathers were originally for, and the answer dismantled one of the most persistent assumptions of 20th century evolutionary biology. Feathers did not evolve for flight. They evolved for other functions and were only later co-opted for aerodynamics. The evidence is clear. The most basal dinosaurs with filamentous structures were fully terrestrial and had no wing morphology of any kind. Phyloplumes and simple feathers appear before any structure that could generate aerodynamic lift. Their most probable original function was thermal insulation, traps of body heat for animals with active metabolisms that needed to maintain their temperature in variable environments, and intraspecific visual display for communication between individuals of the same species. Visual display leads us to the next revolutionary finding: the true color of dinosaurs. For decades, reconstructing the color of dinosaurs was considered pure speculation. Everything changed when researchers demonstrated that melanosomes, subcellular organelles that produce pigments in skin and feathers, are preserved in the fossil record in sufficient detail to infer the color they produced. Microraptor guy, a four-winged dromaeosaur from the lower Cretaceous of China, was black with metallic iridescence similar to modern crows and starlings, a pattern we now recognize in several small mammals of open habitats. Anchiornis huxleyi, which lived 160 million years ago in the late Jurassic, had an extraordinarily detailed color pattern. Body feathers black and grey, flight feathers on all four limbs with black and white bars, and a brick-red head crest. It was an animal as specifically colored as any modern bird species. Psittacosaurus, an early Cretaceous ceratopsian from Asia, has provided perhaps the most complete color data for any dinosaur. Dark brown back, lighter belly, and a counter-shading pattern that modern biologists specifically associate with animals living under closed canopy where light falls vertically, and the counter-shading neutralizes the shadow cast by the body itself. This dinosaur not only had specific colors, but those colors told us what kind of habitat it lived in. All of this points to something that paleontology took far too long to take seriously. Dinosaurs had complex social lives, with sophisticated visual communication, signals of individual and species identity, probably with elaborate courtship rituals comparable to modern birds. They were not primitive survival machines. They were animals with rich and varied behavior, as different from modern reptiles as modern mammals are from their Permian reptilian ancestors. Predators and the arms race. To understand dinosaur ecosystems, it is not enough to study herbivores. The history of dinosaurs is also the history of their predators and the extraordinary coevolution between predators and prey, which produced some of the most spectacular structures and behaviors in the fossil record. Theropods, the group of bipedal carnivorous dinosaurs that includes the small Coelophysis from the Triassic to the gigantic Tyrannosaurus rex from the Cretaceous, and which gave rise to modern birds, represent one of the longest-lived and most successful evolutionary lineages in the history of terrestrial life. For 165 million years, theropods occupied the niche of top predator in virtually every terrestrial ecosystem in the world. Allosaurus fragilis was the dominant theropod of the late Jurassic in North America. Measuring between 8 and 12 meters in length and weighing over 2 tons, it was the apex predator of the Morrison Formation ecosystems, where it coexisted with some of the largest sauropods that have ever existed. Its skull anatomy is revealing. The skull was relatively light and thin-walled for its size, suggesting that the bite was not its primary weapon. Instead, the neck musculature was extraordinarily powerful. Paleontologists have proposed that Allosaurus used its head like an axe, with up and down strikes powered by neck muscles to tear the flesh of its prey, rather than holding and biting it like a modern tiger. Vertebrae of Morrison sauropods are known to bear bite marks consistent with this behavior, and most revealingly, some of these marks show signs of subsequent healing. The dinosaur survived the attack. The fossil record does not just show deaths, it shows survival ability. Large herbivores responded to predatory pressure with extraordinarily varied defensive arsenals. Sauropods had in their size their first line of defense. A healthy adult Brachiosaurus was practically invulnerable to any predator in its ecosystem. But some also developed active weaponry. The tails of diplodocids tapered to a tip so thin that biomechanical analyses calculate they could be swung at speeds sufficient to produce a sonic crack, a pressure wave capable of incapacitating a predator that approached too closely. Stegosaurs responded with a different strategy. Their bodies were protected by a double row of ossified dermal plates along the back, which, as we have seen, served functions of display and thermoregulation as well as deterrence, and their tails were armed with laterally oriented spikes up to a meter long, capable of causing serious injuries. Specimens of Allosaurus are known with perforations in the ischium consistent in shape and size with the caudal spikes of a Stegosaurus. The coevolution between these two animals is not a hypothesis. It is engraved in the bone. But while the large theropods are the most iconic, the small ones are evolutionarily more significant. Maniraptors, the group that includes dromaeosaurids, triodontids, oviraptorids, and ultimately birds, were developing during the Jurassic and Cretaceous a series of traits we now associate exclusively with birds: symmetrical and asymmetrical feathers, hollow bones with walls less than a millimeter thick in some species, complex nesting behaviors, and parental care directly documented in the fossil record. Velociraptor mongoliensis was actually about 70 centimeters tall and weighed between 15 and 30 kilograms. It was feathered. It had a relatively large brain for its size, with an encephalization quotient comparable to some modern birds. Its famous sickle-shaped claw on the second toe, according to the latest biomechanical analyses, was not an instrument for gutting prey, since the forces generated by its musculature were not sufficient to cut through thick skin. It was more likely a gripping instrument used to hold prey in place while the teeth and other claws did the work. Fossils from Jadocta, where a velociraptor and a protoceratops were buried simultaneously while fighting, show exactly this behavior. The velociraptor has its foot claw embedded in the throat of the protoceratops while holding it with both arms. The Jurassic world, an ecosystem in balance. To understand the dominance of dinosaurs, it is not enough to study the dinosaurs themselves. One must understand the world in which they lived, because it was the interaction between dinosaurs and their environment that defined the unique character of the Mesozoic. The fragmentation of Pangaea, which began 200 million years ago and continued through the Jurassic and Cretaceous, was not just a geological event. It was the architect of dinosaur diversity. As the supercontinents separated, dinosaur populations became isolated on different land masses, subjected to different environmental pressures, driving speciation through geographic separation, the same process that today produces distinct species on islands or in separated mountains. Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south developed dinosaur faunas with their own identities, intermittently exchanged when land bridges allowed sporadic migrations, but with sufficient isolation to maintain separate evolutionary lineages. Jurassic climate was among the warmest and most humid in Earth's history. There were no permanent polar ice caps. Temperatures at the poles were mild, between 5 and 15 degrees Celsius in summer, and conifer and fern forests extended to latitudes that today are under permanent ice. Carbon dioxide levels were 4 to 6 times higher than today, producing a global greenhouse effect that kept the planet ice-free. Epicontinental seas created coastal corridors of moderate climate and highly productive riverine ecosystems. It was a world designed, if one may use that term metaphorically, for herbivore gigantism. The Morrison Formation, a sequence of sedimentary strata deposited between 156 and 147 million years ago in what are now the states of Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, is our most detailed window into late Jurassic North America. Since its discovery in the second half of the 19th century, during the so-called Bone Wars, the frantic competition between paleontologists Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope over who could describe more new genera produced more than 70 dinosaur genera, including Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Camarasaurus, Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, and dozens more. What makes the Morrison fauna extraordinary is not the presence of giants, but the coexistence of multiple giant species. 4 or 5 genera of sauropods lived in the same ecosystem, something without parallel in any modern ecosystem of large mammals. The immediate question is, how did they avoid competing with each other? The answer lies in their different skull morphologies and neck lengths. Brachiosaurus, with its long vertical neck, reached the tops of conifers at heights of 12 to 15 meters. Diplodocus, with a long but more horizontal neck, could sweep mid- and low-height vegetation over a vast radius. Camarasaurus, with a shorter neck and a more robust skull, processed tougher vegetation with thick stems and woody branches, which other genera avoided. Each species had its precise feeding niche, minimizing direct competition and allowing a density of large herbivores that would have seemed impossible without documentation. Geochemical analyses of Camarasaurus teeth revealed something even more surprising. These animals undertook seasonal migrations. Strontium and oxygen isotopes in different layers of dental enamel, which is deposited sequentially over the animal's life like tree rings, show changes consistent with movements of up to 300 kilometers between high and low altitude areas following the availability of water and vegetation during dry seasons. The world's largest dinosaurs were also long-distance migrants, comparable in behavior to modern elephants or wildebeest. The plant world sustaining all this animal biomass had no flowers. The Jurassic was dominated by gymnosperms, conifers from multiple families, cycads, palm-like plants that today survive as relics in tropical regions, ginkgos, of which the only surviving species, Ginkgo biloba, is said to be a living fossil, and tree ferns up to 10 meters tall. Compared with the angiosperms that would dominate the Cretaceous and Cenozoic, these plants were relatively less defended. They produced fewer alkaloids, fewer complex tannins, fewer physical deterrent structures. Sauropods, with their enormous digestive tracts and ability to ferment cellulose for days, were perfect machines for exploiting this biomass. Geochemical analyses of Jurassic soils show that large sauropod ecosystems were highly ecologically productive. Dinosaurs fertilized the soil with their excretions, dispersed seeds along their migration routes, and their trampling controlled vegetation density in ways analogous to what we observe today in African megafauna ecosystems. The origin of birds, the most important transition. In 1861, 2 years after the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, workers at a limestone quarry in Solnhofen, Bavaria, extracted a rock slab that contained one of the most important fossils in the history of science. It was an animal about the size of a magpie, with clearly developed wings and symmetrical and asymmetrical feathers preserved in extraordinary detail. But it also had teeth instead of a beak, claws on its wings, and a long bony tail instead of the pygostyle of modern birds. It would be named Archaeopteryx lithographica, and over the next 160 years it would be interpreted, reinterpreted, and discussed more than almost any other fossil in history. For decades, Archaeopteryx was seen as a unique transitional fossil, an exceptional specimen in an otherwise discontinuous fossil record. Chinese discoveries in the 1990s and 2000s irreversibly transformed this perception. Dozens of feathered theropods from the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous began to fill the gap between classic terrestrial dinosaurs and modern birds. Anchiornis, Xiaotingia, Epidexipteryx, Sapionis, Confuciusornis, and many more. Archaeopteryx was not an anomaly. It was a node in a dense cloud of transitional forms, and the distinction between non-avian dinosaur and bird proved to be an arbitrary line drawn in an evolutionary continuum. Today we know that birds are maniraptoran theropod dinosaurs. They are not relatives of dinosaurs. They do not descend from dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs, in the same sense that humans are mammals or dolphins are vertebrates. This is not a semantic question, it is the logical consequence of the cladistic method, which defines groups by their shared evolutionary history, not by external appearance. The origin of flight in avian dinosaurs was one of the hottest debates in 20th century paleontology, and although the outlines are now much clearer, some details remain the subject of active research. At least 2 models were proposed: the arboreal model, in which feathered dinosaurs living in trees developed gliding and then active flight as a way to move between the treetops, and the terrestrial model, in which fast runners developed aerodynamic lift as a tool to leap onto prey, climb inclined surfaces, or escape predators. Current evidence suggests that reality was more complex than either of these 2 simple models. There were likely multiple evolutionary experiments in different lineages with different results, and true flight emerged from that experimental diversity in at least one lineage, which would give rise to all modern birds. What is indisputable is the evolutionary consequence of that origin. Birds are today the most diverse group of terrestrial vertebrates on the planet, with approximately 10,000 species distributed across all continents, including Antarctica. They have colonized habitats that no other terrestrial vertebrate has managed to inhabit, such as the heights of the Himalayas, underwater abysses during diving excursions, and the driest deserts on Earth. The wandering albatross can remain in the air for years without landing. Extreme birds can survive temperatures below -60 degrees Celsius in Antarctic darkness. Hummingbirds can maintain a metabolism 20 times more active than that of a resting human. All this diversity and adaptive capacity has its roots in the innovations that Jurassic theropods were developing 150 million years ago. Birds are not the result of a break with dinosaurs. They are the culmination of 165 million years of dinosaur evolution. Behavior, society, and the limits of what we know. One of the deepest changes in dinosaur paleontology over the past decades has been the recognition that dinosaurs had complex social behaviors, and that the fossil record, if examined with the appropriate techniques, can reveal aspects of that complexity with astonishing precision. The most direct evidence comes from nests and signs of parental care. Maiasaura peeblesaurum, whose name, meaning good mother lizard, reflects the enthusiasm of its discoverer, paleontologist Marion Brandvold, was one of the first dinosaurs for which solid evidence of parental care was established. Nests in dense colonies, incubated eggs and hatchlings with joint bones still in the process of ossification at the time of hatching, indicating that they were completely dependent on adults for feeding and survival for weeks or months after birth. Oviraptor Velociraptor, whose name, meaning egg thief, was unjustly assigned when it was found near a nest that later turned out to be its own, was found in a brooding posture over its own eggs, with its arms extended over them exactly like a modern chicken. The posture was preserved because the animal was buried alive by a sandstorm at the very moment it was protecting its nest. Ichnofossils, that is, tracks and traces preserved in rock, provide another dimension of social behavior. The Davenport Ranch site in Texas contains the footprints of at least 23 sauropods moving in the same direction, with the tracks of younger individuals concentrated in the center of the group and the tracks of adults on the periphery. This is exactly the herd movement pattern we observe in African elephants, where the young are protected in the center of the group. What is remarkable is not only the behavior itself, but also that we can infer it directly from the stone, without any intermediary. Dinosaur cognition is a more speculative territory, but no less fascinating. Relative brain size, studied using the encephalization quotient, which compares the brain volume to that of an animal of equivalent size, varies considerably among dinosaurs. Large sauropods had small brains relative to their body mass, consistent with animals of relatively stereotyped behavior and low behavioral plasticity. Large theropods, like T-Rex, had relatively larger brains, with especially developed olfactory bulbs, consistent with an extraordinarily acute sense of smell. Smaller maniraptors, particularly troodontids, achieved encephalization quotients comparable to the most cognitively capable modern reptiles, and some analyses suggest that certain late Cretaceous genera may have had cognitive abilities comparable to modern highly intelligent birds such as corvids, parrots, and starlings. The sounds produced by dinosaurs are another domain in which modern paleontology has made surprising progress. Analysis of the sclerotic bone, the bony ring surrounding the eye in birds and dinosaurs, allows inference of whether an animal was diurnal, nocturnal, or crepuscular, based on the relative diameter of the pupil. Large herbivores were predominantly diurnal. Velociraptor and several other dromaeosaurids had structures consistent with crepuscular or nocturnal activity, which makes sense for a predator that would hunt under low-light conditions. Regarding vocalizations, the most interesting clue comes from hadrosaurids, the duck-billed dinosaurs of the Cretaceous. Several genera had hollow cranial crests that functioned as resonance chambers. Parasaurolophus walkeri had a crest forming a resonance tube up to 1.8 meters long, and acoustic analyses show that this structure would have produced frequencies of around 30 Hz, at the lower limit of human hearing but perfectly perceptible to animals with the appropriate auditory capacities. These low-frequency calls, like those of modern elephants, could have propagated over kilometers through dense vegetation, coordinating the movements of large herds across extensive territories. The global world, dinosaurs in every corner of the Earth. One of the most remarkable features of dinosaur dominance is its geographic scale. Dinosaurs did not dominate only certain continents or climatic zones. They dominated all continents and all climatic zones, including some where their presence seems deeply counterintuitive. Argentina is today one of the countries with the greatest paleontological wealth of dinosaurs in the world, and its fossils have continuously rewritten textbooks since the 1980s. It not only hosted the first known dinosaurs, such as Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus, but also some of the largest that have ever existed. Patagotitan, Argentinosaurus, Futalognkosaurus, all are southern hemisphere sauropods that demonstrate that gigantism in dinosaurs was not an exclusively North American or Asian phenomenon, but a global trend expressed independently in multiple lineages and on multiple continents. Argentina also hosted some of the most formidable predators of the Cretaceous. Giganotosaurus carolini, described in 1995, could reach 12 to 13 meters in length, rivaling Tyrannosaurus rex in absolute size. Biomechanical analyses suggest, however, that its skull morphology was different, a longer and narrower skull, teeth more laterally compressed, better suited for cutting than for crushing bone, indicating a predation style different from that of T. rex. Two distinct evolutionary solutions to the same problem: how to hunt and kill 50-ton animals. Africa during the Jurassic and Cretaceous shared fauna with other continents through intermittent land connections and dispersal across shallow seas. The Tendaguru Formation in Tanzania, excavated mainly by German expeditions in the early 20th century, produced a fauna comparable in richness to the North American Morrison Formation. Giraffatitan branchi, reclassified from Brachiosaurus and considered the tallest known dinosaur, with an estimated shoulder height of over 12 meters, Dicraeosaurus and Kentrosaurus. The faunas of Tendaguru and Morrison are so similar that paleontologists debated for decades whether the two continents were connected by land at that time, although the most likely explanation involves dispersal across archipelagos in the still-emerging Atlantic. Cretaceous North Africa hosted one of the most extraordinary and least-known faunas in the dinosaur record. The Kem Formation in Morocco and Algeria produced at least 5 genera of large theropods coexisting in the same riverine ecosystem, including Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, now recognized as the longest known dinosaur, with estimates of up to 16 meters, and Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, another superpredator comparable in size to T. rex. The coexistence of several superpredators in the same ecosystem suggests that they were specialized in different prey. Spinosaurus focused on fish, as its narrow skull, conical unserrated teeth, and low center of gravity indicate a specialized fish eater, not a dinosaur hunter, while the other predators targeted herbivorous dinosaurs. Spinosaurus deserves a separate paragraph because its story is one of the most fascinating in modern paleontology. Known from a specimen discovered in Egypt in 1912 and destroyed during a bombing in World War II, it was for decades a ghost in the scientific literature. Discoveries in Morocco in 2014 and 2020, with a specimen including an almost complete tail, revealed an animal unlike any previous image of a dinosaur. Short hind limbs, a low and forward-shifted center of gravity, and a tail with long dorsal and ventral processes forming a fin-like structure, analogous to the tail of a crocodile or otter, clearly adapted for propulsion in water. Spinosaurus was semi-aquatic in a much deeper way than any previously known dinosaur, and the nature of its ecology had been completely misinterpreted for a century. And then there are the poles. One of the most counterintuitive discoveries of dinosaur paleontology is that these animals also inhabited polar regions, where winters involved months of nearly total darkness and temperatures that, although warmer than today, were still challenging. Deposits in Alaska, northern Canada, Australia, and Antarctica have produced fossils of dinosaurs living above 60 or 70 degrees latitude. Analyses of growth rings in their bones show seasonal slowdowns in growth, consistent with changes in food availability during the polar winter, but not complete growth stoppages since these animals did not fully hibernate. Some probably migrated to lower latitudes during the darkest months, as modern birds do. Others, especially the largest, could tolerate periods of scarcity thanks to their enormous thermal inertia and energy reserves. Dinosaur dominance knew no climatic boundaries. The Cretaceous, apotheosis and transformation. If the Jurassic was the consolidation of dinosaur dominance, the Cretaceous was its absolute peak, and simultaneously the period in which the world began to change at a pace that would test even the adaptive capacity of dinosaurs. The deepest change was the revolution of flowering plants. Angiosperms, whose origin is still debated, but whose explosive diversification is precisely dated between 130 and 100 million years ago, transformed the planet's terrestrial ecosystems on a scale comparable to any mass extinction, but in the opposite direction, not destroying but building new complexity. The conifer and fern forests of the Jurassic did not disappear suddenly, but were gradually displaced from the most productive niches by plants that produced seeds enclosed in nutritious tissues and attracted animals to disperse them. Flowers produced nectar and visual attractants to be pollinated by animals. The mechanisms of animal attraction and reward that angiosperms developed co-evolved with insects, producing the extraordinary diversity of pollinators we see today. Bees, butterflies, flies, beetles, and hundreds of thousands of other species. Dinosaurs did not remain static in the face of this transformation. Hadrosaurids were probably the most spectacular evolutionary response to the angiosperm revolution. They developed dental batteries of unprecedented complexity in the animal kingdom. In an adult Edmontosaurus, the dental battery contained up to 1,400 individual teeth compacted into a continuous mosaic, with replacement teeth forming in columns beneath the functional teeth. The result was a high-resistance grinding surface, capable of processing woody and fibrous vegetation of a hardness that would have destroyed the dentition of any Jurassic sauropod. Hadrosaurids became the dominant herbivores of Northern Hemisphere ecosystems in the late Cretaceous, displacing sauropods toward more southern latitudes where angiosperms had not yet fully dominated. Ceratopsids, the group including Triceratops and its relatives, developed a different but equally effective strategy. Sharp, horned beaks, similar to those of a giant turtle, combined with scissor-like dental batteries to cut tough vegetation. Triceratops horridus, with its 3 horns and broad bony frill, is perhaps the dinosaur most familiar to the general public after T-Rex, and rightly so. It was one of the most common terrestrial animals in the Hell Creek ecosystems of North America in the last 2 million years before the extinction. The coevolution of plants and dinosaurs in the Cretaceous is not only a story of response to pressure. It is also a story of mutual creation. Herbivorous dinosaurs, by dispersing seeds, controlling vegetation density, and fertilizing the soil, actively influenced the composition and structure of plant ecosystems. Angiosperms, by producing fruits and vegetation of higher nutritional quality than gymnosperms, selected in favor of herbivores capable of exploiting them. A planet without herbivorous dinosaurs would have had different flora. A planet without angiosperms would have had very different herbivorous dinosaurs. Life is not just the result of evolution, it is its own context. Before the extinction, the world on the threshold. 66 million years ago, the planet's dinosaur ecosystems were, according to all the fossil record tells us, fully functioning. The most detailed analyses of the fossil record from late Cretaceous formations such as Hell Creek in North America, Maastricht in Europe, and Los Alamitos in Argentina show no gradual decline in dinosaur diversity in the millions of years leading up to the extinction. Dinosaurs were there in abundance and diversity up to the very stratigraphic level marking the boundary, and yet the world was changing in ways that, in hindsight, seem to foreshadow the catastrophe. The Deccan Traps, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the planet's history, whose main activity began around 66.5 million years ago, were releasing colossal amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide in what is today Western India. High-resolution geochemical analyses show that these eruptions produced pulses of global warming of between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius, superimposed on the baseline climate of the period. The oceans were experiencing fluctuations in their chemistry. Coastal and marine ecosystems showed signs of stress. Were dinosaurs in decline before the asteroid impact? This question has generated one of the most heated debates in paleontology in recent decades. Some statistical analyses of the fossil record suggest a reduction in the rate of new dinosaur species appearing in the late Cretaceous, especially among North American ceratopsians and hadrosaurs. Other analyses, with different corrections for geological sampling biases, do not find this pattern and conclude that dinosaurs were in normal dynamic equilibrium. The discussion continues in the specialized literature, and the honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we do know for certain is what happened 66 million years ago. An asteroid between 10 and 15 kilometers in diameter struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico with an energy equivalent to several billion nuclear bombs. The impact instantly vaporized material within a radius of several hundred kilometers. The shockwave propagated through the Earth's crust and atmosphere. Ejected material was launched out of the atmosphere and re-entered across the globe, heating the stratosphere to temperatures that ignited global wildfires. Dust, soot, and sulfur aerosols blocked sunlight for months or years, collapsing photosynthesis worldwide. Temperatures dropped 10 to 20 degrees Celsius within a few weeks. Food chains, which depend on photosynthesis at their base, began to disintegrate from the bottom up. Non-avian dinosaurs, because of their dependence on productive ecosystems, their relatively high metabolic rates and their inability to survive a prolonged interruption of photosynthesis, could not survive this collapse. It was not the impact itself that killed them all at once. It was the cascade of consequences that followed which eliminated them over the course of decades or centuries. The fossil record does not have the temporal resolution to distinguish between decades and centuries in this context, but in geological terms, the extinction was instantaneous. Those that survived were those capable of living on resources not directly dependent on active photosynthesis. Seeds and insects preserved in the soil, carcasses of dead animals, nutrients dissolved in water. Small omnivorous mammals survived. Turtles and crocodiles, with their slow metabolisms and their ability to reduce energy consumption almost to dormancy, survived. And birds survived, probably thanks to their small size, flexible omnivory, and ability to use seeds stored in the soil as an energy source during the dark months. What remained the legacy of the dinosaurs? The Cretaceous to Paleogene extinction 66 million years ago eliminated all non-avian dinosaurs, but it did not eliminate the dinosaurs. Birds are theropod dinosaurs that survived the catastrophe and diversified for an additional 66 million years. When you hear the song of a sparrow or watch an albatross in flight, you are witnessing 165 million years of dinosaur evolution in action. 21st century dinosaur paleontology is a discipline unrecognizable compared to what it was barely 3 decades ago. New technologies have opened windows into the past that previous generations could not have imagined. Neutron and X-ray computed tomography allows fossils to be scanned without destroying them, revealing internal structures that were previously inaccessible without destructive dissection. X-ray spectroscopy detects traces of melanosomes in fossil feathers and allows the inference of the actual coloration of animals that went extinct 150 million years ago. Stable isotope analyses reconstruct diets, geographic ranges, and migratory patterns with unprecedented precision. Paleoproteomics, that is, the analysis of ancient proteins preserved in bone tissue, is beginning to reveal information about the molecular biology of dinosaurs that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. In 2020, a team from the American Museum of Natural History discovered and sequenced type 1 collagen preserved in the bones of Tyrannosaurus rex and Brachylophosaurus canadensis. The analysis of the amino acid sequence independently confirms, without relying on morphology or phylogeny, that T. rex was more closely related to modern birds than to crocodiles. Proteins are more resistant than DNA, which does not preserve beyond a few million years even under optimal conditions, and paleoproteomics could eventually provide information about dinosaurs far older than those of the late Cretaceous. Computational biomechanical models make it possible to simulate the movement, speed, and behavior of extinct animals with a precision that improves each year. The analysis of Tyrannosaurus rex locomotion using finite element modeling, published in 2021, suggests maximum speeds of approximately 5 meters per second or 18 kilometers per hour, slower than previous estimates based on trackways, but its sustained walking speed was comparable to that of modern mammals of similar size. It was not the swift runner of the movies, but neither was it the clumsy brute that some earlier revisions had proposed. It was a perfectly functional animal in its locomotor capabilities, optimized for energy efficiency rather than maximum speed. The fossil record of dinosaurs is, paradoxically, both extraordinarily rich and profoundly incomplete. It is estimated that less than 1% of all individuals that ever lived had any chance of becoming fossils, and of that 1%, an even smaller fraction would have been exposed by erosion in an accessible location at the moment someone happened to be looking. Regions of the world that remain geologically underexplored, such as parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Siberia, and Antarctica, may harbor completely unknown dinosaur faunas. Spinosaurus, whose true nature was not understood until 2020, lived for decades in museums as a misinterpreted animal. The next Spinosaurus is waiting in some unexcavated geological formation for someone with the right tools and training to find it. Every year, discoveries in China, Argentina, Morocco, Mongolia, and dozens of other countries continue to add chapters to this story. Yi Qi, described in 2015 in China, was a maniraptoran dinosaur with wing membranes similar to those of a bat, supported by a styliform bone, unique in the history of vertebrates, an evolutionary experiment in aerial locomotion that left no descendants, but demonstrates the extraordinary diversity of solutions that evolution explored within the dinosaur lineage. Dinosaurs mirificus, known for decades only from its 2-meter-40 long arms, the largest of any known bipedal dinosaur, turned out, when complete specimens were found in 2014, to be an 11-meter-long giant ornithomimosaur with a spinal sail, toothless beak, and omnivorous diet, whose fossilized stomach contained at the same time gastroliths, fish remains, and plant material. It was an animal that no one would have predicted. Nature continues to be more imaginative than any paleontologist. Why they dominated? The complete answer. We have reached the end of the journey, and we can now answer the question with which we began. Why did dinosaurs dominate the Earth for 165 million years? The answer is not simple. It never is when it comes to life, but it can be articulated with precision. Dinosaurs dominated because their anatomical innovations gave them comparative advantages in the environments of the late Triassic that proved decisive in moments of maximum pressure. They were not invincible. They were not inevitably superior to all their competitors. But when the mass extinctions of the Triassic-Jurassic eliminated their main rivals, they had exactly what was needed to be the ones who most rapidly filled the vacuum. They dominated because once they began to diversify in the Jurassic, they were able to explore the space of the ecologically possible in ways that no other group of terrestrial vertebrates has matched before or since. In size, from the 100-gram Microraptor to the 70-ton Patagotitan, a range of 6 orders of magnitude within the same phylogenetic group. In life strategies, from the specialized fish eater of North Africa to the 300-kilometer migrant of the Morrison Plains. In behavior, from the solitary nocturnal wanderer to nesting colonies of thousands of individuals. In geography, from the polar circles to the equator, from sea level to altitudes where the air is thin. They dominated because the fragmentation of Pangaea gave them the perfect geographic laboratory for diversification, separated continents acting as independent evolutionary experiments, with occasional faunal exchange that generated new diversity rather than homogenizing it. Each time a new land bridge connected Laurasia with Gondwana, or Asia with North America, the result was an explosion of new species in both directions. And they dominated also because they were lucky, not once, but twice. The Permian-Triassic extinction eliminated the competitors that might have occupied the large niches before dinosaurs arrived. The Triassic to Jurassic extinction eliminated the competitors that had kept them in a secondary position for 30 million years. The probability that a group of vertebrates would receive 2 consecutive opportunities of this kind at precisely the moment when it was best positioned to take advantage of them is extremely low. If either of those extinctions had not occurred, or had occurred at a different time, the history of life on Earth would have been different. There would probably be no dominant dinosaurs, and almost certainly there would be no human beings. Because the other side of the story of the dinosaurs is our own. Mammals have existed for 200 million years since the same Triassic that saw the birth of dinosaurs. For 165 million years, mammals were small, nocturnal, insectivorous or frugivorous animals living in the interstices of dinosaur ecosystems. Some reached the size of a badger. None reached the size of a Labrador dog. The fossil record of Mesozoic mammals is the record of animals that survived under the shadow of dinosaurs with enormous success, but without the possibility of expanding beyond the niches that dinosaurs left available to them. The extinction 66 million years ago was for mammals exactly what the Triassic extinctions had been for dinosaurs, a catastrophic opportunity. In the 10 million years following the Chicxulub impact, mammals diversified into the niches of large herbivores, large carnivores, aquatic animals, flyers, and runners. From the nocturnal insectivores of the Mesozoic emerged whales, elephants, bats, horses, primates, and from the primates in the last 300,000 years emerged us. Everything we are exists because a 10-kilometer asteroid struck the Yucatan at precisely the right moment, giving our mammalian ancestors the same opportunity that the Triassic eruptions had given dinosaurs 200 million years earlier. Contingency is the deepest principle in the history of life. There is no inevitability. There is no destiny. There are organisms and there are environments, and there are moments when the intersection of both produces something the universe had not seen before. Dinosaurs were one of those moments. For 165 million years, they were the most successful answer this planet has ever produced to the problem of how to live on the surface of the Earth. And then, in the span of a few geological decades, they disappeared, all except those who learned to fly. When you look at a bird, yes, any bird, from the most common sparrow to the most majestic condor, you are looking at a dinosaur, an uninterrupted lineage of life that began 230 million years ago on the plains of what is now Argentina, survived the greatest asteroid impact of the Cenozoic, and today sings on every continent on Earth, nests in the trees of our gardens, crosses the oceans without rest, and dives 300 meters deep into the waters of Antarctica. They are the heirs of the giants. They are the continuation of the longest and most astonishing story this planet has ever produced. And we, the curious primates who dig up their bones and reconstruct their colors and calculate their speed and wonder what the world was like before we existed, are the indirect result of their extinction. We exist because they dominated, and we exist because they died.